Welcome to chapter 6. Today we are going to talk about function and its application in C++ programming. Please pay attention, have your Visual Studio up. As soon as I start practicing some example, feel free to start practicing with me and bring any of your questions to my attention. I'll be more than happy to support you with any of the challenges, either technical challenges or maybe some theory question about what I'm discussing in here as much as possible. Before everything else, I'm gonna one more time bring it up about the type of programming. At the beginning of the course, I have already touched this, that we are going to have multiple type of programming, especially for C++ programming. I already mentioned this semester we are only focused on C++, but next semester we are gonna have the more advanced version of it called object-oriented programming. The difference between what we are doing right now and the one which is 1PR3 object-oriented programming is about more detailed program in order to create the same object. For example, creating a box with different sizes as length, height, or width. We can do it with two methods. We can just completely finish everything under the same .cpp file, which is just regular C++ programming, or we can have it with more detailed information and do it through multiple file, a separate header file and separate .cpp file called object-oriented programming. So which is not in the scope of one CP3, thus that part object-oriented is gonna be next semester under 1PR3. So but right now in here, I'm gonna just focus more on modular programming, regardless of its object-oriented or regular programming. Usually we need to, when we are going to create some object, we need to break down different pieces of creation of that object to, for example, smaller pieces to make sure that it is manageable and we have enough room in order to include accurate and maybe detailed information in order to create the same example, suppose creation of a box. So the first step in order to just start modular programming is working with function. Definitely you heard from myself over the last maybe couple of lectures, just calling main function. Function usually is just multiple statements, including data types, variables, all other information being added, even, for example, all of the equations, all of the cout, cins that we just list down underneath in order to perform a task. That's what we call it a function. Like what I just said, like main function. I have already also mentioned the difference between main function in C++ programming and any other function is, while we are working with main, let me just quickly show you what I am talking about. Like in here, we are not allowed to change the name. In here, we cannot change the name main, which is the variable for this function. We must still go ahead and use the exact same name as main. But today I'm going to add more information since we have already practiced creation and main function many time over the last couple of lectures. So everybody's supposed to right now be kind of, I would say, expert defining a main function. Always starting with the data type integer, following with the variable called main, definitely opening and closing just a blank parenthesis right in here, and including any statement right inside this two bracket. In order to define a main function, you must always remember to open and close a bracket. If you forget for any reason any of this, you are gonna get error. So everything must be enclosed right inside these two braces, or let's say curly bracket, in order to define a main function. So this is what we have discussed so far. The scope of the lecture for today, we are going to learn how to create any customized function. Definitely for the customized function, still we need to follow some of the rules that we have already discussed and practice about how to create a main function, right? But with some adjustment, we do have more room in order to choose our preferred data type. Also, I just mentioned it while I'm practicing defining a main function, I do not have an option to use any other data type. I must stick using to only integer as the data type for the main function. And definitely, I have no choice to choose a different name for the variable. I must always use main. But today we are going to practice how I can choose a different data type. For example, here on my screen, you can see void. And of course, how can I choose a different name for the function name or the variable which I'm assigning to that function? For example, in here, you can see function 2. In the next one, you can see function 3. And here for the main, I started using integer, and I must always use for the main integer. But you can see in here, I'm using void, which is another data type. For function 3 also, I'm using void. As I earlier mentioned, some of the rules, such as making sure that you must include the open and close bracket or parentheses in here, it must remain the same. You must open and close your curly bracket. Definitely you must include all your statement the way that you do in here for the main function. You have to follow similar rules for any extra functions such as function 2 and 3 in this example. What you see in here generally is going to be the template. At the same time, I'm gonna bring up my Visual Studio. You may want to do the same. I'm gonna clean up my screen, start not only explaining things in here to you, definitely just having some demonstration. This is what we know from other lectures so far, to just work on the main function, include everything just inside the main function, and display on the console. What I am talking, for example, in here is about, suppose that we have like as many as we want, like different information, or I would say statements, right, inside the main function. There are situations we need to create another function. For example, void function 1, right? Void function 1, and I have to open and close parentheses, and right underneath I have to open and close curly bracket, very similar to that. So now there is something important. You may ask, what's the location for defining any extra function? Should I have it before main function or after main function? This is super important. Pay attention. While you are creating any extra function, such as the one in here, void function 1, definitely, technically, it doesn't matter if you are defining it after your main function or you are defining it before your main function. Technically, it doesn't matter. You can do it right after or you can do it before. But if you are doing it before, still you must make sure it must be after using namespace, right? Otherwise, inside that function, you have to keep repeating a cd colon colon. And definitely, you are going to get error if this is before, this is after the function. So technically, it doesn't matter if your function 1 or any other name is like before main function. But best practice, as somebody who's going to become expert at some point, my advice to you is always try to keep your main function just at the beginning. Why is that? Because the difference between any extra function and main function is while you are defining any extra function after your main function, definitely anything you define in here, you have to call it regardless of how many more function you have. You may have 100 more function after your main function. But every single other function must be called inside the main function. That's why my advice to you is also, I'm repeating, also technically it doesn't matter even if you define this one right in here before, so I'm calling it to avoid error. Also, technically, it doesn't matter your extra function is before main function or after main function, but best practice anyway, since you have to call them inside the main, is just keep adding all of extra function after your main function. The reason behind it is simple to understand. Since if your main is keep moving down and you've got like tons of other function, in order to call other function inside the main, you have to keep scrolling down until you find the main function and call it. And usually, especially for beginners, when they are trying to call any extra function inside the main, opportunity of doing it wrong and calling it inside by mistake another function is too much, giving them error, wasting their time and energy. So try to keep it at the beginning and add any extra function right underneath. So now, having that in mind, one more time, there is no limitation for the number of functions that you guys are going to define inside the program. No limit, no boundary. You can have as many as needed. Start with 3 steps. I'm gonna write down just a comment in here. You may want to pay attention, take a note, and if you need, even take a screenshot from my screen. Also, I do have a summary of what I'm gonna write down for you inside the lecture slide. You can see that defining a function, you need a function call and function definition, right? And of course, each of this is going through few steps. Instead of focusing on the lecture slide, I'm gonna demo the whole thing right inside the Visual Studio, and I'm gonna write down the summary for you. How to define, you may want to practice this with me to ensure everybody can learn properly. How to define function. These are the steps that you need, right? You need to go through 3 steps. So there are 3 steps in order to define a function. I'm gonna just maximize to make sure everybody can see clearly. Step 1. Step 1 is the function definition. Function definition. Before I move to the next one, let me demo what is function definition. Remember right in here, I said void function parentheses line 14. I'm talking about line 14. And then I opened and closed the bracket right in here. This is what we call it function definition. Means go ahead first, define your function, choose the right data type, choose the right variable name for, let's say I would say in here function name for yourself based on whatever works for you. And this part, line 14 to line 18, of course anything included later, you may want to include everything else inside this, is going to be a part of function definition, which is called a step 1. That's your step 1. A step 2. A step 2 is function, you can also see it right in here, prototype. We always must create a function prototype. Like, for example, I'm going to show you in that example shortly, function prototype. Function prototype means after I define my function right in here, I have to just, for example, if it's this one, just copy this line 15, and paste it right above main function, right? And add semicolon at the end of it. And this is what we call it a step 2 or function prototype. And right after that, we have to go through step 3, which is function call. And remember I said, regardless of how many functions you create in your code, you must come back to your main function and call the function inside the main function, which is considered as step 3 of creation of function. So now, try to remember these 3 major steps in order to create any function in C++ programming. Let's go back to the lecture slide and review exactly what I said quickly right in here. So you need to define the function. Simply means anything such as defining a variable in here. If you need any equation, if you need any C in, C out, everything must be in this step done through function definition called step 1. Right after that means complete the body of the function. So once again, look at this example. Function definition in this example is given to you. Define the function, for example, the name, and then see out, see in, return, and everything. Next step is, after you define your function, you need to make sure that you have a return type, which is, again, like for example, in here, call the function. What is the function name in here? Print heading. Remember I said just copy this one and come back to the call. In this example, I already created the prototype for the function call. All I have to say, just copy this part and just paste it in here. This is gonna be considered as call function, right? Call function. Call the function inside the main. So now let's go ahead, quickly practice it using one example. To make sure, how do I create a function from scratch and get some result out of it? And that function is gonna be something in addition to my main function. If you are having something like me in here, you may want to clean up anything extra. Follow me a step by a step to create some extra. I'm gonna still keep this note just for your reference on top of everything, because it is like a comment, not command. Definitely it's not gonna hurt, and you are gonna be able to still keep it in there. So I'm going to create a program with 2 functions. One is going to be main, the other display message. So I'm going to just include one simple extra function. I'm going to start with my main. Main is created. I created the template. I do have the body, and I'm going to even in here include my return 0. So this is my main. But before I go ahead and add anything to my main, I'm gonna start defining a new function following these 3 steps. Remember I said either you can have it before or after. I prefer to have it after. So I'm gonna use void for data type, and I'm gonna call my function to be display message. Display message. I gave it a name, and you must still see it underlined red until you are done with the function definition. And as soon as you open and close your bracket, you won't see any error anymore, right? So now I'm ready. So this is going to be my function, void display message. I'm gonna define it. I'm still working on function definition. I simply want to display a message, nothing more at this point. So I'm going to say cout a message, whatever message. For example, I'm going to open my quotation and I'm going to say hello class or hello 1 CP3 or whatever. And then maybe just \n, and of course, just a simple semicolon. This is going to be my first function, call display message. I'm done with the step 1. Step 2 is now go ahead and start just prototype, right? Usually prototype is not something complicated. You can simply just have your void display message and then start your function main and just maybe call it if it's not something complicated. So, but usually we copy and paste only this much. If we do have more information later, I will mention it. If you do have more information, you have to remove variables and stuff from here. If you don't, you just keep it at this stage and then go inside the main and call the function as a step 3. If you don't have too much information, even this at some point is not mandatory. At some point, you may even ignore prototype, but in some other cases, still you need the prototype to avoid error. So I'm going to give it to you and we will try. Even at some point, you may even ignore that one. So now I go ahead and I start calling my display message inside the main. So first, I'm going to see out another message which doesn't have anything to do with display message. And I'm going to say right in here, hello from main, to make sure you guys are not gonna confuse this hello is from here or there. So I'm gonna say hello from main to see the difference. And then I'm closing it with semicolon. Right after that, remember I said a step 3 is function call. And in order to call the function, you simply need to either type or copy and paste to avoid typo. Just copy the function name and definitely the parentheses the way I do right in here. Bring them, just copy this too. And bring them right in here, paste them at the semicolon. And this is what we call it, function call. And this whole thing, we call it function definition. Step 1. And this is your step 3, function call. So now I simply want to add one extra cout and then I'm gonna be okay. Cout, another extra message for me. And so first it will read anything from this function. That's what I am having as an intention. So I'm gonna first cout this one from main, then go read any information from display, and then go back to the main and cout another message. Why I add like 3 cout? To show you how is the order, what will happen. Here I'm gonna say back to main function. And I'm gonna add another backslash n and close it with semicolon. So let me just quickly minimize and show you what will happen right in here. So I started only using IOStream. If it is a complicated program, definitely you must add other libraries and header files in case you need to. Otherwise, just follow these few steps in here. Define your main function, and simply go ahead, define any new function, create the prototype and create the function call, and make sure that you have your green check and simply hit the debugger. So now you can see that definitely first thing which is coming up is hello from main. Simply means debugger will start from main function. It will first see out the first message, which is hello from main. I'm gonna even zoom to ensure everybody is seeing it clear. Right after that, since I do have in line 14, look at here, in line 14, I've got another message, which is just go look at the display message. Means just pause the main right in here, go to the next function, read any information from there. In this case, it is a hello one CP3. and then come back to the main again, which is line 16, and see out the back to main function for me. Make sense? So it will start from main. I will go through like the lines one by one, exactly based on the order. At this point, I did add like this one too. Now, simply since I said some cases you don't need the prototype, I'm gonna also comment the prototype, means remove it from the debugging process and debug one more time to see what will happen. As you can see, no technical concern. Since, why is that? Why I do not have technical concern? Because still I'm just defining a simple function without having any extra information inside the parentheses. But as soon as we make it a bit more advanced function definition, and we do have extra information right in here inside this parenthesis, then having a prototype is not optional. It's mandatory. We must address it. Otherwise, we are going to get error. But still, from the day one I'm teaching function, I remind to students always keep in mind, in order to define any function, you need to go through three steps. Because if you learn it from day one, it's going to be much easier for you to keep doing this three step for creating a more advanced function. Any questions so far? Anything clear? Perfect. So now I'm gonna go ahead, if no more question, I'm gonna go ahead and just proceed. Hopefully everybody is clear with that. Quickly, one more time. This is a flow of control, exactly what I said. Programmer first, it will start looking at the main function. If anything, it will just print out that one, then it will look at any extra function being called inside the main function, regardless of main is after or before. Still main is gonna be considered first. Even if main is after void, debugger naturally first will look at main. That's important. Even if I move main down and bring display message before main, still the order is debugger jump over this one and will always consider main first. And then it will look at any extra other functions and will go through the lines accordingly. So calling the functions means all of the like information from the extra function needs to be addressed inside the main function, including just the function name, parentheses with information or without information must be addressed right in here. That's a summary of how to create a function. I already touched the name function prototype. As you can see right now, I'm going to give it as detail, but even for the basic simple example, still I started with the function prototype. Now it's time to just give you more detail about a step 2, or what this function prototype is, which is going to be a mandatory part of creation of any function now on. So I already said, when we are going to create any extra functions such as void display message in line 21, right in here, I'm going to highlight it. You may need to go ahead, define extra information right inside this parentheses. As you can see, I just left a question mark right in here, such as maybe defining another data type, defining another variable inside that parentheses. So in that case, while you are going to call the function, still you have to include some of the information in this line, and of course you have to include more information in line 10 as well. That's what we call it, function prototype. So you have to include, this is the for the function prototype, or you can call it even you have to include the function header. Function header means the first line of the function definition. Function definition and first line is called function header. Try to remember these keywords. I just left you a message in here, a comment in here. So this whole part, line 21 to line 24, is called function definition. And line 21 by itself alone is called a function header for any function. And usually a function prototype is a copy of function header with some adjustment. If there is any information inside the parentheses, we have to remove the data type. We have to remove the variable and keep the data type while creating a prototype. And we have to remove the data type and keep the variable while we are defining the function call. So that's the difference. We'll practice it in more detail. Like for example, in here, I've already defined the function prototype. So I already have it. I created function as display message. If this parenthesis is empty, you can still ignore this line, but if it is not empty, you must include data type, function name, parenthesis, and add a semicolon at the end and call it function prototype. This is what we call it, function prototype. If you remove somebody is saying while they remove the prototype, they got some error. Probably you have some syntax error. You have to look at that and fix it. As you notice, I removed it and no error. And now I'm bringing it back. So if you have many functions, for example, I'm going to add another one right in here just as an exercise. So for example, void display 2, again another parenthesis, and then in here, for example, say cout, another message. Let me just maximize, like hello class this time, and then \n, and then semicolon. Let's repeat the 3 steps. I already created function definition for the second function called void display 2. Now I'm going to create the function prototype for this one. So I simply copy this whole header, function header. I go back to before main. Definitely it must be before main one more time. Pay attention. Before main and after using namespace. If you create your function prototype before you're using namespace, you are gonna get error because you need to again add a steady colon. That's why it must be before main and after using namespace a city. This is important. So I created the function prototype right for the second function, and I need to call that one too. So now since I do have display 2, I must call it. So I'm going to call it right in here. So display message back to main function. Suppose I'm going to call it in here, call display 2, and then return. So now if I go ahead, debug one more time, let me see, this is the previous one. I did not have display 2. Now I added display 2. Definitely you still have to have hello from main, hello one cp3 back to the main function, and then right after that an extra line should be added to here if I debug right now again, which I am going to, being as hello class. Let's close this one, and demo having 2 function being added to the program. Here we go. As I said, now you do have, so first it's reading the main function, which is hello from main, and it's printing it right in here. Then it will, in line 16, is commanded to say go to display message and print hello one cp3 as it is done right in here. Then come back to the main, which is back to the main function, and print this line, which is line 18 of the code. And then move to the second function in line 28. You do have another function, and inside it, it is mentioned cout hello class. Then go ahead and read that one. So this is the order. Make sense? Some reaction to ensure everybody is following, please. Thank you very much. So now let's look at how to send data into a function. So if you follow me step by step and practice with me, definitely things are gonna make more sense. I started from blank, from scratch, from just a simple extra function. I gradually added a prototype to it. I added another extra function, two function, in addition to main function, all together three function in the same code as it is displayed on my screen. And now I'm gonna practice sending data into a function. So follow me. We are going to send or to pass some value into a function, but pass it at the time of call, means while it is inside the main. How do we do that? Remember, I said you have the option to add some information inside the parentheses exactly where your function header is defined. And now that's the time we are going to add some information in there. In order to do that, any information being added to look at this blue part, I just highlighted the parentheses, any information I'm going to add inside this parentheses, I'm calling it arguments, right? So argument could be a variable in a function, which is going to hold some value, some information, which I'm going to pass it to the main function later. So I'm reading it from the display message, for example, and then I'm passing it to the main. So that's what we call it argument, right? So, for example, in order to define any argument, we must again use a data type and a new variable, not another one that it is defined, for example, inside the main. We have to define another variable. For example, I'm going to say integer num. Integer is a data type. Num is a variable. So I simply defined an argument in line 24. And that's what we call it, passing information into a function. So I'm going to now, remember I already had hello, one CP3. Now I'm going to just remove this backslash n and add a little bit more information right in here. And now I'm going to say, go ahead and print that num, then and L, then semicolon. So it's very similar to the time that I'm going to define any variable from default right here inside the main function. But please pay attention. We can never ever add any argument to the main function until later that we are going to talk about object oriented. In that part, sure, I'll be having more information and skills to share with you. But here in the scope of this course, we don't use any information inside the parentheses for main. We don't do that, okay? Main is gonna remain empty. But argument can be defined for any other functions right after main, right? So now I added integer num, and now if I'm going back to the main function to just go ahead and call the function, I cannot leave the display message in line 16 anymore to be empty. Why is that? Look at this example. Since I already said num in here, while I'm going to define the prototype, look at here, even my prototype is underlined green. That underlined green simply means something is missing. Remember, I said when I'm looking at function prototype, if I do have an argument in here, I must still keep the data type inside here. Since this is integer, I must in here type integer or int only and not to include the variable. I shouldn't include the variable, which is num in this case. I must only include integer. That's one adjustment. If I do have an argument, another adjustment is now go back to the function call. Function call is otherwise. Here I keep the data type. Here I must keep the variable. That's what we call it function call. But the thing is, since this is a number, instead of just keeping it as, like, for example, the same num as a variable, if I do so, I must define num in here. Like, for example, I have to go ahead and say integer num being assigned to 5. Then num is known, right? Since this is inside another function, I cannot use num without data type. Num as a variable without data type doesn't make sense in here. You are going to get error. So you have to go ahead and define first that same variable in here, then use it. Or simply, I'm going to comment this one and just use 5 in here. Still, that will work. Because 5 is a number, you don't need to define it. It's known for the debugger. But if you use a variable, variable must be defined before being used. So you have two methods. Either use num in here, but define it, then use it, or just simply use a single number. It's a factor of which kind of example you are practicing. Now, let's go ahead and practice this one. I'm gonna debug and see the difference. I did pass some information into a function, which is an integer, and that integer is 5. So instead of just simply, before I did not have like 5 in here, but now I do have hello from main, then display message is hello 1 cp3 and num5, hello 1 cp3 5, right? And then I do have like the other message back to main and then hello class. So this is how we can pass information into a function. Make sense? If so, some reaction please, some comments, some feedback to ensure everybody is following. More feedback. Are you here? Good to hear from you. Thank you very much. So, at any part you want me to pause and repeat, feel free to ask. I know these informations are new for you. I don't expect you to immediately learn them by heart. No panic. These are new. That's why I keep repeating and repeating until it makes sense to you. And still interact with the class. And have this in your heart that I'm here to support. If you need help, if you need extra explanation and clarification, feel free to ask. So I think at this point, let me give you some break. I'm going to pause recording. And out of recording, I'm waiting for you to come to me and see me for any of your questions. And we'll come back and continue next. So far, we have discussed how to create any function in 3 simple steps. I'm going to quickly repeat. These are the steps. You need to go through the function definition. The function definition could be either before main or after main, but best practice is always keeping it after main because look at here, I do, for example, have only 2 extra functions. In case you do have many, many more, then simply you can just scroll all the way up and call it inside the main. Otherwise, you have to just each time scroll down until to find main and call that function inside main again. Second step is function prototype, like the way that I have created 2 function prototype for the extra 2 function I do have in here. And the very last step is going to be the function call. For every single function, we have to call it inside the main function as explained. Now, there are a bit more information that I'm going to go ahead. This is exactly what I said. I'm going to go ahead and add to this one. There are situations that instead of only having one argument, we can have multiple arguments while we are defining the function. For example, in here, I already created an argument for my function display message as integer num. But you can simply add as many extra data type and variable as you want. For example, instead of only having one, you can simply say comma. Maybe even next one could be a different data type. There is no rule to just keep all of them the same data type. And then say num1 or anything similar. So now, how do I adjust the rest? If I add an extra information into my argument for the first function in here, I have to, as I mentioned, go ahead. First, look at my data type. Sorry, look at my function prototype, adjust accordingly. In here, I added one extra data type, one extra variable. So right in here, I must go ahead, add comma. And remember, I said, while preparing your function prototype, only include the data type, not the variable. So if in here you have double, then add double right in here as well. And definitely you have to go ahead. So in this case, I'm gonna make this num and I'm gonna define this right in here. And in this case, if you add num in here, you must go ahead and add any extra, like for example, num1. And definitely you must also define this one to num1. Like for example, I want to give it, since it's double, let's give it a decimal point just for extra practice, like this, right? So you have to go ahead while you are defining any extra function, you have to go ahead, make sure just include all of them. Another example here on my screen, you can just look at this one. For example, I do have main function. This is going to be all my main function. And then right after that, I'm having this function to be void show sum. This is the name and data type of the function. Anything in here are called arguments. These are my argument. How many arguments do I have? In this example, I have 3 of them. So if I have 3 arguments right in here, I have to adjust inside the prototype, since all of them in this example are integer, and integer, definitely I have to use the same right in here. And definitely I have to go ahead and check and adjust my call function as well. So this is going to be my prototype. My call function is gonna be, since the name of the function is show sum, with all of those information as variables. So now look at here, names in here, or let's say variable names in here are num1, num2, num3. Either I can use exactly the same num1, num2, and num3 and just use them in here, but definitely I have to go ahead and define them in here as well. Or I can just change the variables, right? It doesn't matter. For example, here I use double num1. So here I'm gonna add another maybe message. Use maybe then num1, 2. And then either in here, I can use num and num1, or I can use any other variable. It doesn't really matter and it won't give me error. I check and see everything looks fine. I have no error, nothing. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna just debug. Now I have to just have, again, first message is gonna be hello from main, and then it should move, look at here, hello from main, and then move to hello one cp3. Look at here, since I do not have any backslash and endl or something, or maybe a space or whatever, my num and num1 are printed right back to back. But definitely I told you how to clean up your display if you would like to. And right after that is coming back, printing back to main function. And right after that, hello class. So now you learned I do have option to add as many as arguments into the function as I need. For example, if I need 10 of them, I can add 10 of them. And definitely my for function prototype and function call must be adjusted accordingly. Next, let's look at passing data by value. We have already practiced it, but I'm gonna just quickly go ahead and show you one more time. I just practiced it in here. It's gonna be exactly the same. For example, look at here. I'm considering for num to already be defined as 5, right? So, and then instead of having it in here, remember I said you can just simply not to use variable and use the number as well. But if I use num, I can also have another option to not, for example, hard code it right in here. I can use cin, user interaction, and have the num to be printed after the debugging process. So that's all other option. Now, another example in here, instead of num, I call it val, standing for value. So I say, instead of integer num, I say integer val. And then I'm going to overload the val. So I'm going to say even or odd. Val, for example, argument in the calling function is val, and then the num also inside the parameters is also 5. So that's what we call it, pass it information to parameters by a value. So you can simply first define your value is 5, and next, instead of the way that I did it in here, exactly this is what I did. I defined first my num is 5, and then I said, okay, and my num is 1 is 2.1. Then I said, okay, I'm going to pass num and num1. Very similar to this one. Now I'm going to look at function in menu-driven programs. What does it mean? Remember, in order to create extra function, of course, I am looking for creating another extra object. And since I want to simplify the process for many reasons, such as debugging process, such as maybe even making it more detailed and troubleshooting becoming easy, then I create different functions and I communicate between the functions. So not only, for example, every function needs, that's a must, every function can must return to main, but still there is another option that these two functions also can exchange information, right? That's another option. We are going to practice that one too. So function, we use them in order to show me a menu to choose from. Let's say it's a restaurant. I'm having a menu to choose from. I'm going to have first high-level function. High-level function usually is main. Main is first considered. And then I'm going to have some detailed function right after that. First, for example, come up as showing me 3 options as the menu. This is going to be my high-level function. And then bring up maybe that 3 options separated as a single function as well. So that's why we say higher level function can call general purpose function, right? That's another type. Next is about return statement. We already practiced return statement from the beginning of the semester, like in line 23. After a function is going through the debugging process, then we are able to use a return statement like simply return 0. And then right after return 0, then the execution or the debugging is going to just stop right in there and it will move to the location 0. So we are going to somehow command the programming to stop right in this line and do not continue keeping the processor busy for no reason. We are commanding it to just stop. We are terminating the program right in this point to not to go over and over again. If I'm using a void function, like the one right in here, I do have 2 void function. Then I simply can just not to use return. For void function, like this two, I can just simply close it with just a curly bracket and avoid using a void. But for main, which is an integer, always I say go back to the zero, return to zero. That's the difference. This is one example that I have. Another example in here. For the main, I return zero. For the void function, any void function, regardless of how many arguments I have in there, I can just, at the end of it, I just close it with just a curly bracket, right? Or if I'm using return, I can simply use return, not return zero. Both will work. Now I'm going to just practice returning a value from a function. Like for example, in here, I've already gave you this practice to define some argument. Now I'm going to return it. I'm going to return a value back to the statement that called the function, like in here. Like for example, I'm going to define a variable in here, and then I'm going to just return it inside the main. Let's practice that one. For example, I do have integer like the void display in here. Now, if I'm just defining integer num and num1, and if I have more, instead of defining them in here, I can define them right inside my void function. That's another method. Or instead of just simply saying see out this one, I'm going to add more line in here to practice this part with you. So I can go ahead and I can say define another double, which is going to be maybe another integer with some decimal. And then I'm going to do some math in here. Double result. And then go ahead, say what is result. Result is going to be, for me, I have num. I already defined num plus num1. This is going to be my result. And then, since I already defined what is result, I can simply say now return result. Instead of all of this, I can go ahead and say return result because I already defined it. Now result will be passed to the main function, and I must close it with semicolon right in here. Return result. Anything? So then if you are here, you have to adjust the rest as well. So if I wanted to just explain this one, this is my function. It's an integer again. I do have two parameters. This whole thing is called argument, but I do have two parameters inside this argument. This is one of them, and this is another one. I'm just going to add them together and return the result. So this is what I say, value being returned to the next function. So I'm going to return, either you can say just return the result, or you can say return num1 plus num2, even without defining what is result. Either will work. So next, let's go ahead, practice this one in another example. You may want to make yourself busy with me because I'm going to put together another example and practice this with you to return some numbers together. Since I've already have this one, I'm gonna clean up the second. I don't need this one and I don't need this one. So I'm gonna define a new program and practice everything from scratch. I'm going to clean up even my function and create a new one from scratch. We already have this note in here to go over every single step together. So I start with defining a new function. This is my template. I'm gonna start with defining a new function. My new function is gonna be a simple integer. So I start with integer sum. Remember I said for every function definition, first you have to start with the function header line. Function header line means open parentheses and then open and close curly bracket. If you are gonna have argument, start with your argument inside the parentheses. I'm gonna maximize in here. Like for example, in this case, I'm gonna say int num1, comma, another integer num2. You may have this question. Remember I said when you are going to have multiple variables being assigned to similar data type, you can have, for example, inside the function, you can say integer num1 comma num2. But inside the argument, no, you cannot do that. You cannot say integer num1, ignore this two num2. You cannot say that. You must define data type individually. Inside the argument, it must be individual definition for them. Otherwise, you're going to get error. And simply, I'm going to say return num1 plus num2. This is all I want for this example. And semicolon, since we are going to practice how to return. So now I'm going to go ahead and define my main function. Remember, before that, after I start defining a function, this is my first step. Second step is just simply copy your header line, move to the beginning of the code, means before main and after using namespace, paste that one, add a semicolon, then go inside parentheses, remove every variable and still keep data types. If you have two parameters inside the argument, keep both integers and remove num1 and num2. So this is a step one, which is the function definition. This is a step two, which is the function prototype. Then you have to create your function call. Function call means this time, just go ahead. My function name is sum. Say sum, open and close parentheses, and then define any argument accordingly inside. So how do I do it? I'm gonna first define the variable. Since I have two variable in here, instead of using the same, I'm gonna in here say integer val, and I'm gonna assign 20 to my first value. And since both of them are gonna be integer, I'm gonna say val1, value 1, and val2 standing for value 2. My value 2, I'm gonna assign it to, let's say, 40. And my next integer is going to be total, since I'm going to have summation. So I call it total. At the same time, I define all my integers in a single line, since all of them are using the same data type. Now I'm going to call the sum function, which I already did. I said sum. But I can do, since I already defined the total, I can say total is assigned to total of the sum. Sum means num1 and num2. So, but in here I should say val1 call sum, and then come back here, read val1, and which is comma in here, val2, and then semicolon. Then I want another extra line, so I'm gonna say cout exactly whatever I have as val1, val2, and total. So I'm gonna say cout the sum of, then the sum of, actually take val1, so I would say cout the sum of val1. Then I can say another, and then I can say another val2, and right after that, then I can say is, then I can say is total. Then go ahead and read total. And of course, if you need, you can add handle at the end. So there is one typo in here, like this. And I already have return 0. So I'm gonna just minimize to show you everything at once. So integer sum. In here, I've already defined what is my sum. I already said sum is going to be integer num1 and num2. I have num1 and num2, and I'm going to return num1 plus num2. And then I just at the beginning, right before main function, I said integer sum. I kept integer right in here, these two integers right in here. And since I had the space, it was giving me error. You shouldn't have a space. You have to just clean it up. And then right in here, I called it. My sum is gonna be in front of total, I'm gonna call it, which is going to be the 20 plus 40. Everything looks fine. I'm gonna debug. Here we go, it's coming up. So at this point, I should simply say only, okay, the sum of 20 and 40 is 60. Since I don't have a space before is, if I create a space, it's gonna look nicer. So I'm gonna close debugger and debugging again. So it's gonna tell me the sum of 20 and 40 is 60, as you can see right in here. The sum of 20 and 40 is 60. So this is how we can return some information from one function, do some calculation, and call the sum. Clear? Okay. Next. So let's look at returning a value from a function. So exactly like what I have. I called it, this is how I return a value from a function. My value is num1 plus num2, which I'm returning it to here. And as you can see, I send it to cout. I send it to cout as a total to be printed. I already explained all of this slide using my example. Now I'm going to return a Boolean value. I already practiced how to return a void. Now in here I practice how to return an integer. Now I'm going to return a Boolean value. Boolean by itself is a data type, but a function, while it is set to Boolean, means it is looking at true or false situation. So function can return a true or false. I practice returning an integer, I practice returning a void, and now I'm practicing returning a true or false situation to the main function. So we can return it inside the body. So function body must contain, like in here, a return in order to return that Boolean to the main function. Let's practice this one together. I'm gonna clean up my screen and go over another example for you. I still keep the template, but I clean this part and go over another example. Since I'm practicing Boolean, so I don't need this integer function anymore. I'm creating a Boolean function from scratch. So I don't need this comment anymore to create more space in here for you. You already are aware of the 3 steps. So at this point, we are going to have a program to use a function which is returning a true or false, which is a Boolean. Therefore, I have to go ahead and first start defining a Boolean function. To define a Boolean function, we don't write Boolean. We simply write bool as a data type. I'm going to give it a name like is even, or it could be odd or anything, because is even is going to be my variable name. And then I'm going to start with some parameter inside my argument, maybe a single one, like integer num again. And then I'm going to start defining the function body. So since I'm defining a true or false, again, I'm going to use bool status. This is going to be my variable. And since it's a true or false, it's a conditional statement. So I'm going to flash back and practice how we were defining a if else condition. At the same time, we can review that one. So I'm going to say if anyone who forgot about how to use if else, you may want to pay attention. I'm repeating in here. I'm going to say if my number in here, num, if num is a percentage of 2, then is equal to 0, right? Then status is going to be, because I already defined the status, I can use it. Num, if num, this one is a percentage of 2 equal to 0, then a status is going to be assigned to true. This is my first condition, which is the number is even if there is no remainder. If there is no remainder, your remainder is 0, then your number is even. Else, what is else status in here? Else status, you can have it in the next line to look nicer, is going to be assigned to false. So if your remainder is not 0, then status is going to be assigned to false. And now I want you to return the status. Remember I said you must include a return statement. In this case, is return status. I'm done with the function definition. Next is I have to define my function prototype. So I copy header line. I go to the beginning of the code. Before main, after namespace. I paste it right in here. I add semicolon and I remove my variable num. If I keep the variable num, I'm going to get error. This is prototype. I'm going to again remind you. This is prototype, which is a step 2. Now I need to define it. I need to call it inside the function, or let's say main function. Since I know I need some value or number for the num, either I can use num again inside the main, or I can give it another variable, which I'm going to give it another variable as val. And then I'm going to get a number from the user. So far, I was giving it like inside as a hard-coded, like the previous example, I used 20 and 40 for val 1 and val 2. This time to practice scene again. So I'm going to say, or let's say user interaction. So I'm going to have a pop-up on the screen and I'm going to say cout, enter the number, and then simply you may want to just use \n or endl or just nothing and keep cout another message right on the same line and say cout if it is even or odd. Enter the number and then cout if it is even or odd. Again, either you can use space in between the lines or not, which I'm not going to use in this case, and then in what is my variable is val. In your val. Right now, it's time to indicate whether, since I'm asking if it is even or odd, in the val, right? Now I'm going to indicate, is it even or it is odd? Remember I said I can use if a statement. So I can go ahead and say if, open your parentheses, define your condition. Condition is going to be the call function. So I'm going to call this function if is even, which is the name of the function. So remember what I am doing in here. It's not always using the call function simply in a single line or as on a statement. Call function could be called inside the equation. Function could be called inside the conditional statements such as if, else, while, switch, or whatever. All of them are still called functions. So please do not get me wrong. Always, it's not, for example, calling it simply in a single line. You can mix it with other commands and still be a call function. So if is even, then what was my variable? Variable is val, so use val, then close the parenthesis, move to the next line, see out something for me. See out that number, which is the val. See out val, and then right after that, say is even. Is even, backslash n. Else, get out of here. Else, go ahead and see out. Make sure that you've got your semicolon in here. See out. Again, still you need to call the val and say is odd. Is odd. Backslash n and close it up with semicolon. This is it. And of course, you need to return 0. So I'm going to minimize to show you the whole code at once. So I started with hash include iostream. Using namespace, I define my Boolean variable in order to display or demonstrate how do I pass a true-false situation to a function or return a true-false situation to a function. So I define Boolean for is even because I'm looking at the condition, is my number even or odd, and I'm passing it to my main inside the if-else statement. I look at the green mark, I do have everything to be okay, so I can debug and see the results on the screen. So as you can see, first pop-up question is right in here. I'm asked to enter the number if it is even or odd. So I can simply go ahead and say, I'm going to use some even, and then 24 is even. It's just putting it inside this conditional statement, which is highlighted in light blue, and then 24 is even. Any questions so far? Anything? Some feedback, please. You guys are following? Perfect. So let me carry on. You guys, any of you, at any point you need more clarification, feel free to stop me, to pause me, ask, and I'll be more than happy to support you accordingly. So far we have learned how to practice integer, how to return an integer, how to return void, how to return true false situation or boolean, and now we are going to look at local and global variable. I need everybody, before I start the local and global variable, if you are in the class right now, feel free to ensure that you have already understood what I discussed. If you are watching the recording before you continue watching the rest of the recording, make sure you learn how to define variables or how to create functions. Then come and just follow me with a local and global variable to be just clear what's the difference between this. So far we have like the practice and a skill to define any variable. Look at here inside the main function. So now any variable which is called inside the function, such as val in here, or maybe this boolean, this is also variable, also the data type is boolean, but it is variable. These are what we call them local. right? So as you can see in here, any variable inside the function is called local to that certain function. Simply means if I define status inside the Boolean function in here, status is not accessible to main if I don't define it in there again. Status is only accessible inside the Boolean function. That's why we call status in here is a local variable to this certain Boolean function. Similarly, val is not known inside the Boolean function because val is defined inside main. Val is an local variable for the main function. That's what we call it, local variable, right? Local variable, you cannot get access to them inside another function, change them, adjust them, and for example, use them without being defined again. So I cannot use num again inside main. That's why I used val. In previous examples, even I show you and I demo how, if you want to use num again, how to first define num again inside that certain function, then use it. So that's what we call it, local, actually variable. Now, let's just practice another example. Maybe just on the slide, very similar to what I have. For example, num, I just said, either on my lecture slide or the one that I have integer in here. Both of them are what we call them local variable here to the main. And if I'm looking at this another function, num in here also is local variable to this void. That's what we call it, local variable. So now let's look at global variable. Global variable are those variables that you can define them outside a function. Like for example, before main, right in here, define a variable and then use them in any other function accordingly. Like for example, when we are defining a constant. When we are defining a constant, right in here, simply remember in the previous examples, we defined pi as a constant out of the function. Since it is out of the function, we are able to use them inside every other function, including the main. That's what we call it, global variable, or if it is a constant, just global constant. Simply means, like for example, you go ahead and say integer pi. If you define integer pi out of the main, the way I did in here, regardless of you are assigning a certain number to it or not, still pi can be used in here. Pi can be used in here without any requirement for redefining it because it is defined outside every single function. I can use it everywhere. That's what we call it, global variable, right? Now, suppose that I'm assigning 3 point, maybe 4, whatever number to it, then even the number can be used in every other function. That's the difference. So why we do so? Because there might be situation we need an extra variable that we can repeat using it in every other function without the need to redefine it. That's what we call a global function. I already defined pi. You can have, for example, another variable in here, either integer, double, constant, or whatever. So I'm going to say constant this time to practice const. So const or variable, both of them are called global. Global constant, global variable. You can define constant and variable inside function. If it is inside function, is local, not accessible to other. If it is outside, for example, constant val 3 being assigned to 5.9, this is global right now, and this is an integer. I have to include the data type. Then I can keep using val3 inside main, inside is even, without extra step to define it, and that's what we call it global constant if it is a const and global variable if it is just a variable. Make sense? Make sense? Okay, I'm gonna pause at this point and I'm gonna wait for you out of the recording in case you have question. Come see me. So far we have practiced how to define local and global variables. Once again, local and global variables either could be just single simple variables such as like for example integer in here as a local or integer in here as a global, or it can be a constant, again constant if it is out of function, global inside the function is going to be considered as local. Now global variables, in case they are not constant, such as here, if in case they are not constant, they are automatically initialized to 0. Like for example, if it is not a constant, they could be automatically initialized to 0 or null character. So for example, if we define just maybe pi in here with no number, automatically it will be considered 0 until we are gonna reuse it inside either main function in here or boolean function in here and assign some number to it. So initial is just considered as a 0 or null. We call it null. Null is standing again for 0. If it is a character, it's null. If it is just numeric, it's gonna be 0. Now another new term, static local variable. So far we learned what is local variable. Once again means any variable which is going to be defined inside the function and it is accessible only inside that certain function. So that's what we call it, a local variable. Now what is static? A static is a keyword, like in here, it's a keyword. If we are going to have a function which is going to terminate right inside, for example, with return in here, we can use a static local variable to still maintain the detail and information of the content of that function and use them inside the function call as well. That's what we call it, static local variable, in order to maintain the information and use them inside the function call. Let me go ahead and just explain the same thing using an example to ensure everyone is clear enough about what is static and how to define it. This is important. You may want to follow me and just keep practicing how to use static. A static can help you to retain the information. So I'm going to put together another code in order to show that local variables don't retain their value between the function called first. That's the first step. So I'm going to say, I'm going to clean up this boolean. I already have a main function. This is my main function. I'm going to clean it up and just leave the template and define a new program right in here. I don't need this prototype, and at this point I don't need any of those. So I'm going to start with a void function. Start with a void function, give it a name, for example, just show local, since I'm practicing only local. So I don't need argument for this example. I'm practicing just the local. So I'm going to define a local variable inside the function. So I say integer local num. With purpose, I say local because I want to remind you anything inside function is a local. I can assign a number like 5 or whatever. So this is going to be called a local variable. And I simply want to see out just this local number is, just read the number. I called it local num, then say local num exactly as it is, and add end L. That's it. Right? Now, what if I'm gonna give it another number? So I would say local number, same local number. This time, I'm gonna assign it to a different number, like for example, 99, and semicolon. I'm done with defining my show local. I do have two local number. One time it is 5. Later I'm gonna just overload it and give it 99. Now I'm gonna go ahead and look at my function prototype. Remember I said in order to put together your function prototype, just copy your header line of the function, move to the beginning of the code before main and after using namespace, add semicolon at the end. That should be all in case you have no argument like the one in here. I have no argument. But in case you do have argument, of course, you have to go ahead and adjust inside the parentheses as well. Right after that, you need to call the function. My function name is showLocal, so I have to say showLocal, which is the name of my function. This is my function call, and give it semicolon. I'm going to say 2 times because I do have two number. I'm going to call it 2 times, but both could be exactly the same. But why I repeat it? Simply because I do have two local number. One is 5, next I'm going to have it as 99. So this is helping you only to show that local variables don't retain their value between the function call. That's why I call it 2 times. Now you can see. Expectation on the console is having still 5 to be printed only. Look at here. See, also I called it 2 times, but still, since this is a local variable, it cannot retain the adjusted number. So it's just the one which is assigned initially. Boston is going to give me only 5. That's the purpose of this example. So now I'm going ahead with a different approach. Remember, I just used static. In order to fix the situation, I can go ahead and use static to fix the situation, to remedy the situation. So I'm going to go ahead, close this one, and I'm going to go ahead, just look at my function. I called it show local. Now, instead, I'm going to adjust it and say show static and see what is the difference between local and static. I'm going to call it show static. And then instead of just integer local, I'm going to call it static integer, and I don't need a. So I'm going to just add static at the beginning like this and call it a static integer local now. Of course, I need some cleanup in here. Now it is not local number, it is static. I'm trying to edit the previous example to show you the difference. Initially it was local, show local. I'm now showing the static. If I need to make it static and make it accessible to retain the number inside the call, I need to add static. Then here, instead of like for example, uh, like just showing the local num, instead of that, instead of a number, I can say keep accumulating it. So simply means it can add up just by 1. Keep accumulating it, plus plus. And remember, I said I must have function prototype. Since I changed the name in here, I must change the name in here and say show static. It must be exactly the same name. And definitely now I'm going to remove this part and I'm going to start, since I have an accumulator in here, I'm going to call the show static function 5 times. So instead of having only one number, I'm going to keep accumulating it. Suppose I'm going to start from 0 and accumulate 5 times. Let's do that together. So I'm going to say 4. I'm going to put it inside the for loop. Since it's an accumulator, for every time I use 4, I'm going to start from integer count being assigned to 0, semicolon, count, my maximum, I have to define my maximum. Count less than 5. This is my assumption. You can use any other number. This is just for the purpose of this example. And definitely remember I had local plus plus. In here I have to say count plus plus. It is a 4. I do not need to close it with semicolon. If I add semicolon after parentheses, I'm going to get error. Right? So right after that, I need to say now show static, which is going to be the function call. And definitely I need parentheses and I need to close it with semicolon and return 0. So now I can retain, since this is a static, I can retain the information. Now if I go ahead and debug, it will start printing out from 0 5 times. Since s by 1 off is starting from 0, 5 times means stopping by 4. So static number, exactly from here, a static number is 0. And then 0 will be accumulated to 1, accumulated to 2, to 3, and to 4. So now you learn, in case you are going to retain the information and pass it to the main function or call it in the main function, you need to use the keyword static to keep printing like the adjusted or upgraded information in case you have more than one value to display. Now, if you initialize a local static variable, then that will happen only one time instead of being accumulated. What does it mean if I say initialize a local static? A static by itself could be local as well. So now I'm going to adjust it to show you how do I adjust it accordingly. So far, in the previous example, I don't touch anything in here, but I'm going to go ahead, and since in here local num, it was just a static. But what if I, instead of making it like static, what if I make it to just be 5 in here? Let's say being assigned to 5. Then it will start from 5 being accumulated. The difference is instead of previously, look at here, I still have it. It will start from 0 to 4. Now, since this is a local, then instead of considering 0 in here, it will consider the 5, right? It will consider the 5. So now if I go ahead, stop this one, and debug again, it will start accumulating from 5. Look at here. Also still inside the main, I do have the exact same command to start from 0 up to less than 5. But since this is right now local, it is not accessible inside the main. So it's just going ahead and it will accumulate just 5 times. 5 plus 1, 6 plus 1, 7 plus 1, and 8 plus 1. That's the difference while you want to make the static to become a local variable. Make sense? Okay, let's continue with default argument. So far, I just taught you how to use a local static, means just define or initialize the static inside your function, very similar to defining a default. So for example, I'm going to define an argument and give it some variable or some. So far, remember in the previous example, I said, for example, in this case, you can say integer val, but not to define what is val. And later, after you call it inside here, then say what is val. But now, since this is integer, I have to adjust here and make it integer. And definitely in here, I have to adjust it. But before that, I'm going to teach you something new. I'm going to say a default argument. Instead of say integer val, I'm going to say integer is assigned to 0, or val is assigned to 0, or my integer is 0. You can say integer assigned to 0. Simply means this is default. This is what we call it a default argument. Means I already gave it a value right in here. Now, I can mention it in few different way. I can say integer is assigned to 0. It could be any other numbers. Or I can say just integer without the variable. That's what we call it, being a default argument. Instead of, like for example, giving it maybe a variable, we already have a number for it, so it's default. It's going to be considered exactly as it is. It could be 0, it could be 10, any number you assign, that number is going to be your default integer, which we call it default argument. So default argument means an argument that the value for the variable is defined right inside the argument. That's what we call it, default argument, which I already explained. Let me review exactly what I said inside the lecture slide. So I'm going to give you a few examples to clarify for everybody. Suppose that I do have a function called integer get sum. Inside the argument, I have 3 parameters: integer, integer assigned to 0, and again integer assigned to 0. So this method of definition is 100% correct, right? I can just define the parameters inside the argument, but in case I say integer, then integer 0, again, I cannot say integer. Anyone which is default first, after that, either I have to continue with defaults, because this one is not default, this one is default, then I have to continue with default. If I use one default right after that, I cannot use non-default anymore. I must continue with default. Otherwise, it's going to be wrong. It's going to give you error. Another thing is, there are situations that you want to, for example, define few arguments, like in here, I've got 3 parameters inside the argument. But then later, if I want to use them, I cannot say sum is going to be, if this is num1, if this is num2, I can say sum is going to be num1, num2. If it was 3 and I'm going to use only 2 of them, I cannot leave a space between them. Okay? I can just say, okay, I want num1 and num2. If I do have 3 parameters like in here, I can say I want num1 and num2, but I cannot leave a space with comma to omit the one. So one of them couldn't be omitted from a function call. Another thing that I need to review with you is use a reference variable. So reference variable means just go ahead, define your argument right in here. For example, I do have integer 10, and this is going to be your reference for integer for the rest of the process. That's what we call it, reference variable. You can say this is my variable, it's an integer, and I'm going to continue using it, and that's what we call it, reference variable. Another thing that I want you to be aware for different example, If you define a reference variable, for example, integer is assigned to 10, or integer is assigned to any other number. Now you can go ahead and you can, for example, define with an ampersand. Ampersand is standing for add. You can say integer, like in here I'm gonna modify. You can say integer. You use an ampersand, and then go ahead, comma, integer, another ampersand. We can define ampersand. So integer and integer. And this is still passing by reference. Let's go ahead and practice one example as the very last example for today. For example, I'm gonna go ahead, clean up my screen, create another void function in here to practice this one with you. So the purpose is I'm going ahead to create a program to use a reference variable. I just discussed reference variable, so I'm going to show you how to create a reference variable. So I'm going to clean up previous example and start from scratch to teach you how to use a reference variable. So I'm going to start with creating a function. Again, maybe a void function. I'm going to give it double num, just simply as the name of the function. I'm going to give it a parameters as an integer, just integer, ampersand, and a reference variable, ref, let's say val or var, since it's a variable, not a value. So I'm going to say integer, ampersand, reference var. So simply I can define the body of the function and say what is ref var. I have to use exactly the same variable, and I'm going to say this is going to be asterisk assigned to semicolon. This is going to be my reference variable. So this ampersand must, exactly the way that it is in here, you must include it in your like prototype as well. So it is right inside the function header. This is inside the function header. Now it's time to go ahead, create your prototype. Since you are using ampersand, you must include it inside the prototype like this. I'm going to create the prototype in here. Add the semicolon. Remember I said anytime you are copying and pasting the header line to create prototype, you must remove the variable, but you must keep the data type, and if you have ampersand, keep the ampersand as well. So it's the prototype indicating that the parameter is the reference variable. This ampersand means your parameter as reference is a reference variable. If you see this and or ampersand means this is a reference variable. I'm done, and now I'm going to go inside the main function. So I'm going to define first my variable in here. So I'm going to define a value and I'm going to assign it to 4. Then I'm going to see out a command as value is, and then go ahead, read the value, and then go ahead and add and L. This is my first one. And then right after that my value is going to be read, which is 4 in this case. Then I'm going to say cout. Now call the double num, which is a function, or let's say call the function, right? And then again and L. Now I'm going to call the function. My function is called double num, so I'm going to use exactly the same one, double num. Make sure that you have your parameters. I already defined value, so I can use value inside the parentheses, and I'm closing it with semicolon. Now I'm going to see out exactly this one. See out, back to main. See out, back to main. Go read the reference variable and see out back to main. And value is, because this is a reference variable, go ahead, read the value again, right? And L. And of course, return 0. So this is how we return, we are practicing to return a reference variable. We return a reference variable using ampersand. Anytime we do have an ampersand in the header line, we must keep the same ampersand in the header file. Now let's debug and see what we are going to get. So it should make it like multiply by 2, which is done properly. So first, it's reading here, value is 4. It's reading line number 4. And thus, value is 4. Then I'm asking now go look at the function, put the number 4 because this is a reference variable, read it from main, take it to the double num, multiply by 2, get that reference val, multiply by 2, and print it again. So it's taking it from there, and it's going back to main, and printing back to value is 8. 4 times 2, value is 8. And that's how we say pass by reference. And the symbol for it is ampersand. Clear? Perfect, thank you. Now, each reference parameter must contain, if I have multiple, for example, in here I'm gonna add a little bit more detail. In case I'm gonna have multiple integer to be referenced, definitely ampersand must be considered for every single one of them. For example, if I do have another integer, maybe ref2, and I want this to become a reference variable, I must include ampersand in here as well. So have it in mind, if you need to create multiple parameters inside argument and you want all of them to become reference variable, you must include ampersand at the beginning of every single variable accordingly. Then have a space between the ampersand and like for example, if you have ampersand and data type, but if you create a space in here or not create a space in here, it doesn't matter, it won't give you error. Still is fine. Having a space between the data type and ampersand is not important. But if you have a space in here, it is important. So, but here is fine. If you don't have, perfect. If you do have, perfect. No error. Either will work. Once again, if you do have ampersand, you must make sure that you use it inside the header file as well. And if you need it for the function call, you must need to just include it. You must include it in there as well. The very last concept I want to discuss with you for chapter 6, before I close chapter 6, I need to discuss another important concept, and I'm gonna definitely give you another detailed example to ensure everybody learn the function overloading properly. So the last part is how to overload the function. Let me quickly summarize. We have learned how to define a function with no parameter, no argument, how to define a function with multiple parameter inside the argument, how to call a function inside the main, how to define local and global variables and constants, both of them, how to create them, how to create static, either as local static or global, or let's say local static or global static means giving it access to be accessible inside main. And of course, how to have reference variable using ampersand. These are the summary of chapter 6. And I'm going to close this chapter with overloading function. Since we have already learned how to create a function with maybe some data type, some variable and stuff, now we need to see, can we really go ahead and overload the same function without redefining it with new information? That's how we do it. So, like for example in here, first thing first, overloading a function means if initially I had that function to have just one variable, or let's say one parameters inside the argument, exactly the way that I do have in line 22 right now, I do have only one integer. Still, I want the same function to be as void double num, but next time I'm gonna just repeat, suppose that I'm gonna repeat the same function. Overloading means I'm gonna repeat the same function, everything is the same. All I do is I'm gonna make it two parameters, maybe integer, either a space or no space. In this case, I do have ampersand, so I'm gonna use it. And then another integer, maybe var2. Overloading means the only thing for that function is going to change is the parameters inside the parentheses. Like in here, I can say, I do have a void function called getDimension. This is going to be initially one integer. I'm going to overload it. Everything is the same. All I am going to change is I'm adding another variable in here. I'm going to again overload. Still, I'm going to have two, but this time overloading for me is changing the data type. So changing the data type also can be considered as overloading. So either you are going to change the data type or you are going to add more parameters. Both of them are going to be overloading. Same in here. First it was one integer. I changed it to two integer. Next time I overloaded. I kept one integer. I overloaded the other data. I changed it to double. Then I changed the first one to double. So these are all considered overloading. So for example, in here, if I have one integer, like for example, integer length width, double base height. So if I do have these two to be my variables, either integer or double, overloading in this function means, let's say first I'm going to have length. I'm going to overload it next time with length and width. Next time with length and height. Next time with height and base. This is also considered overloading. Let's close this with a great example to ensure everybody knows how to do overloading. I'm going to clean up again and I'm going to create another example from scratch to practice how do we overload. So I'm going to use overload function. So I'm going to create two different functions, one of them integer. I'm going to start with defining my integer function as square, maybe like this, square. And I'm going to give it only one integer parameter inside the argument. I'm going to say integer num. Simple, just maybe one line as a return for the body. Return, just number times number. Number asterisk, actually I can say num asterisk num. This is my return for the first one. Now, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to keep the same function. All I'm going to do is just changing the data type. So, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to copy this whole thing simply for the purpose of showing you I'm just keeping the same function. All I do is just changing the data type to double instead of integer. That's what we call it, overload the function. I created function as an integer, then I overloaded the same function just by changing the data type. It was the integer, I switched it to double. And definitely I must create for the first one prototype must be like this. And since this is prototype, I must remove the num and I'm gonna add semicolon. Definitely I must create prototype for this overloaded one. These are the essential steps of creating function. These are my prototype. And right after that, I'm going to go ahead and call them inside function. Remember, look at here. This is the prototype, which is the overloaded of this prototype. Both of them are square, one time integer, one time double. Now I'm going to just in here define another integer, and I'm going to say just maybe integer user int. This is going to be my integer. And then my double is gonna be again user float. I'm gonna ask the user to give it a float. User float. Okay, double user float. And then I'm gonna get an integer and double. To get, I need to use cout as a comment, and then I'm gonna clean up from here fixed. You know, we used to use fixed before. And then I'm gonna even use show point. And since I'm using show point, I'm gonna go back in here before getting error as hash include, add in here IO since I'm cleaning up, I'm doing some maybe cosmetic stuff in here, so I'm gonna use IO since I'm using fixed and show point. And I want also set precision, and I'm gonna set it to 2, precision 2. Set precision. And the number definitely must be inside parentheses too, and you can go ahead and close with semicolon. This is my first cout, and then I'm gonna say cout again, and I'm gonna say now, since this is going to be user interaction, enter the number. This is going to be an option, and simply maybe some colon and some space right in here, close it with semicolon, and definitely go ahead and use cin. And what was the variable for integer? You have to use user int, say user int semicolon. And since you have 2, you can, instead of having 2 line at the same time, use user float as well. Either you can repeat cin user float, or you can use one cin and just have both of them at the same time. Both method will be 100% correct. Now I'm gonna display the square. Since I'm gonna get the numbers after cin, then I want to display. So I would say cout the square for both user int. So cout square, a square is gonna be the variable. For user int, a square is gonna be, look at here, I do have 2 function, means now I'm gonna cout the function call. So cout the first function call, which is a square, first for int, which is user int, so I have to mention user int. This is my first one, which is the function call inside the cout. Remember I said function call could be inside the cout, could be inside just maybe as a single line, inside equation, inside conditional statements such as for, such as if and else, or while, or switch, or whatever. So I'm calling the first one user int. I'm gonna add some note in here, and again call the second one, which is square. Second one was for double, which is user float. Then go ahead and say user float, right? And right after that, just add semicolon. And that's it. I'm gonna remove this extra space and clean up in here. And I'm gonna just show you how it looks like. So I started with IOStream and IOManip. I defined my 2 function. First one integer. I overloaded with just changing the data type from integer to double. Right after that, I created my 2 prototype for the 2 function. Then I started defining the local variables for those 2 functions inside the main, and then maybe some pop-up information, a little bit of cleanup for the display. And then cin, and finally in line 18, what you see as user int, square user int, and a square user float means the function called for both this function. I look at the bottom of my windows and I say, okay, perfect. I've got the green check mark and I'm good to debug. Here we go. The first question is, as I have as a cout, enter the number. So I'm gonna give it some integer, maybe 7. I hit the enter, and since I need 2 because I'm asking for 2 integer, look at here, cin user input and user float, maybe 2.3. Then it will consider like 49, and because it's supposed to just make it num by num, means like 7 by 7 or 7 multiply 7, and then 2.3 multiply 2.3, where from these two. So I will take the integer, which is the user integer, and I will put it right in here. Since I use 7, so 7 times 7, 49, and then again 2.3 times 2.3 is 5.29. So this is practicing how to overload a function, either by changing the data type like the way I did in here, or keep the data type but add more number of data type inside the parentheses, and so on. Hopefully this is clear enough for you. We are going to use overloading a lot, creating a function a lot. It's not going to be only for one CP3. I really encourage everybody to learn the concept of defining a function, more specifically with reminding yourself all those 3 steps. In case you need extra clarification, I recommend and encourage, definitely go ahead, watch this recording over and over. This is a new concept. If you keep watching what I just explained, demonstrate, practice over this chapter 16 here, definitely your life is gonna really be easy, because I tried my best to explain it as detailed as possible to ensure you guys have enough resources and you don't need to even go back to internet here and there and find any extra information, since I tried my best to give you all you need in order to create functions specifically for one CP3. So I'm gonna pause right in here and I'll see you out of recording.